if any town in Ireland knows how to put on a festival, I'm sure we can all agree it's Kilkenny. From one end of the year to the other, it just seems to be an amazing place for people getting together and having a talk or having a laugh. It was great to get down there last weekend for the first ever Kilkenny Law Fest. I was speaking to Superintendent Paul Maher of the Garda Historical Society about the 100th anniversary of the merging of the Dublin Metropolitan Police and on Garda Síochána. And though that was, an event in Dublin, obviously it had massive national implications on policing in Ireland. It was a really nice discussion. I think there's something there in that festival in the years to come ahead, and I wish everyone involved with it the very best of luck. This weekend brings the Luke Kelly Festival in Smithfield Square. Two events at that involving me, and they're both free. Tomorrow at 2:00, Aoife Barry, the journalist, is chairing a discussion on the ballad boom and how it all kicked off in the 1960s. That's a nice panel to be on because it lets me give a run out to some of the research I've been doing for the forthcoming book on the Dublin pub. So we'll be talking about Paddy and Morty and O'Donoghue, the embankment, all that kind of stuff. At Sunday at 2:00, I'm chairing a panel on Ewan MacColl. Of course, Ewan MacColl was such a massive influence on Luke Kelly. I'm really looking forward to that. Sandra Kerr, who was trained to sing by Ewan MacColl, will be on that panel, and Ronan Burtonshaw, who's done great work on Luke Kelly. You might have heard him on the podcast before, actually, talking about Luke Kelly. So that'll be really, really special. Get along to one of them if you can over the weekend. Enjoy this edition of the podcast. A festival about the law that doesn't include the police is like a bicycle with no wheels, I suppose. And this is a major year in terms of police history. The centenary of the amalgamation of two very distinct police forces in terms of history and culture on Garda Síochána and the Dublin Metropolitan Police. We've just come through the decade of centenaries in this country. We managed not to kill each other. The nearest we came was perhaps the RIC, but we made it out the other side. And I suppose the decade of centenaries began in 2012 with the Ulster Solemn League and Covenant in Dublin. It kicked off really in 2013 with the 1913 lockout, but it carried us right through the War of Independence, the Civil War and the aftermath of that, and the events of 1924 and 1925, the post-revolutionary society, are very, very interesting, and many of them touch on policing history. The end of Monto, for example, something we'll talk about today. I'm delighted to be joined by Superintendent Paul Maher, who really made a mark on the decade of centenaries and brought the Gardaí really right into the heart of those anniversaries on a community level. And in terms of historical work, you did a lot of great stuff around the RTE Decade of Centenaries programme. So before we talk about the DMP, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, or even the Royal Irish Constabulary, I suppose it's worth having a potted history of policing before Robert Peel. We always call policemen the Peelers. Before Peel and the Peelers, how did we police our streets, or were our streets policed at all?
Yeah, so I suppose in Dublin we had the Parish Watch. So the Parish Watch were organised on a church basis. Now there are 10 Parish Watch diaries that have survived. St John's, which would have had a Parish Watch house on Wood Quay, and also St Thomas, which is behind the Gresham Hotel now. So about 10 books in total are in the country. We've digitised 9 of them. If you ever want to see Pirates of the Caribbean stuff in Dublin, you need to read these diaries. They're available in the representative church body. I mean, we have guys crossing the bridge. It's Essex Bridge. We call it Grattan Bridge now. And, he's going down. He leaves the watch house to go down and get some water out of the Liffey for himself. And this guy puts a flintlock pistol to his head and says, "Give me your effing sovereigns or I'll blow your effing head off." So this is the type of narrative that we find in there. We find people being attacked in Fishamble Street. Soldiers, for example, stationed in Dublin at the time were involved in a lot of crime. But it's all recorded there. But the watch system was really interesting because they would give the watchmen wooden shacks, wooden houses, and they might stick them on a street corner. Now, one famous one is Mecklenburgh Street, where they actually erected a brand new one because a man called James Gandon was moving in to oversee the building of the Customs House. So when you find that watch house diary, you'll find that they're erecting this shack basically, but they don't mention they don't mention Gandon, but you know it's Gandon because he lived in number 7 Mecklenburg Street, and that's why they're putting it in. So I suppose the more things change in policing, the more they stay the same, you know.
Before we had the Metropolitan Police in Dublin, we had the Irish Constabulary across the country. Rural policing and urban policing, I mean, was it a very different lot for the rural policeman? I'm thinking about things like, moonshine distilling, agrarian unrest. A policeman in rural Ireland and a lot of a Dublin Metropolitan policeman, presumably very different things.
Yeah, I suppose from the point of view of that period in the late 18th century coming into the early 19th century when Robert Peel came in, people have this narrative that, the London Metropolitan Police are the oldest police force in the world in 1827. Well, actually, the Peace Preservation Force in Ireland was established by Peel in 1814. And I used to enjoy in the museum when these English guys would come in and say, "Oh, your uniform is very similar to ours." And I would say, "Au contraire, yours is very similar to ours." So, and I'd explain this to them. So they'd go off in a huff because, the colonial imperialist thing. So I'd be delighted with myself, little smug thing with my little helmet. But the thing was in rural Ireland, factionism is huge, and that transcends everything. For example, everything including, the land agents. If you weren't from the local area, you were persona non grata. And it was very difficult. I mean, nowadays we battle it out with GAA rivalries. But years ago, it was, hurling matches that involved 60 people on each side. And of course, grudges were held. And plus, folklore is a huge thing. And folklore is a huge thing until the 1960s, 1970s in this country, where neighbours, particularly in rural areas, would intimidate one another with old legends and things like that, and put bad luck on them and curse them and the whole thing. And that is sort of still within their living memory. And, a guard coming down to an individual who says their neighbour is intimidating them. And they say, well, how's he intimidating you? Well, he put eggs in my hay. Okay, but what? Explain to me. And then there's a whole narrative around that. So, it is quite different. And then when you get into Dublin, like, it's entirely different as well, because you've got a lot of soldiers who are stationed in Dublin, and they're committing an awful lot of crime, and it's drunken disorder, what we'd call antisocial behaviour nowadays. They were just a mess, and it was chaotic all over the city with them. And desertion was a big thing, prostitution was a big thing. The adulteration of milk was a big thing all across the country. And you'd have a detective going down to the dairy to take samples of the milk. Such was the severity with which that crime was.
I know you should never judge a book by a cover, but I did buy a book once because the cover was so amazing. It looked like an angry leprechaun holding a bludgeon stick in hand. It was a history of Irish faction fighting.
Yeah.
And it made me think, God, that the policing in rural Ireland in the late 18th, early 19th century was unimaginable to us.
So the yeomanry
is the root of this, and a lot of moonshine production or putching. It was a difficult lot.
And revenue offences. There were, we had a separate revenue police here. And as well as that, the Irish Constabulary at the time in rural areas were called infantry. And they lived in barracks, and they had huts, and they would go around different areas. So you might have Kilkenny City would have a station and a barracks where there'd be, a considerable number of people. But if you went out to a more rural area, you could be in a hut, and you could spend maybe 6 weeks there, and then you'll move on. And that's how that works. So ordinarily, the guy who was the least dependable was put in the hut, and they were sent out like something like, Dances with Wolves.
Is it true that the Irish Constabulary only became the Royal Irish Constabulary because of their involvement in suppressing
the Fenian
Fenians?
Rising? Yeah, the Fenian Rising was that was interesting. But of course, the British knew everything that was going to happen before it happened. And but anyway, Queen Victoria was so impressed with the diligence and their efforts that she gave them the title Royal. The DMP lads were a bit put out by that, by the way. They didn't like the fact that they were not known as the Royal Dublin Metropolitan Police. But I mean, it's off its time,
So the DMP, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, established in the 1830s. This is the immediate aftermath of the Met in London. They're very different cities in terms of scale, culture, everything. But how influenced do you think the Dublin Metropolitan Police actually were by London policing?
Yeah, I think, again, Thomas Drummond, the Scottish guy, was here, and he'd worked with Peel before. He was the chief secretary at the time. And he was the man who really introduced it. Now, Thomas Drummond was quite famous in Ireland at the time, and he was a good friend of Daniel O'Connell, and his daughters actually kept in touch with O'Connell's kids. But there's a statue of him in City Hall, and his portrait hangs in the Orris. So he was a very important individual. But he wanted to have a Victorian police force that were civil, that were educated, that helped people. And of course, you could be fined 10 shillings for gossiping with on the street, particularly if you were gossiping with female servants in the houses of the middle classes. You could be fined 10 shillings. So there was a huge protocol around discipline, and it was about deportment, it was about language, it was about training, and I think it was the Kevin Street Depot at the time, where they trained all those young men. But it started off with about 860 people. But interestingly, the first few
860
yes,
police on the
constables
streets of Dublin.
in
is it?
1836. Yeah, that's how it started. But some of them came from the old police, and it was an opportunity for the city authorities to weed out the guys, the drunks, and the guys who were always in the sub houses. So they got rid of them, and they kept on with the Dublin Metropolitan Police. But interestingly, when they recruited, it was quite local. So for the first few guys coming in, you had silk weavers coming in from Chamber Street and, Francis Street and all those old traditions around the South Inner City.
The term peelers, I think about that song later on, The Owl Alarm Clock, so brilliantly sung by Ronnie Drew. It was a funny song in the early 1960s. It wasn't a very funny song, but in the 1970s, everything had changed. But I said to him, my honour, if I only got the chance, I'd show you how my small machine can make the peelers dance. But the alarm clock, that term peelers stuck around for a long time. Do we know how early people were calling the coppers the peelers?
Yeah, but that was the thing. But the whole thing was the Bobbies, and Bob's your uncle. And I mean, the English have a different take on this in terms of the nepotism that surrounded Robert Peel, and if you got a job in a senior administrative position, of Bob's your uncle, and that's where that thing comes from. But the peelers, very much so, particularly in the northern counties, and it's actually stuck. A lot of people in the northern counties will still refer to the police as peelers,
So most policing is day to day. It's concerned with petty crime and just the ordinary lives of people. But I suppose the unusual difference between policing in Dublin and London is the colonial question, the presence of Dublin Castle. The political context of policing an Irish city is unavoidable, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
from the beginning, was this seen as a Dublin Castle police force?
No, it was seen as a police force for the city. It was only when the Fenians started to get organised that the special branch, and that the first special branch, or the first sort of G squad as it was, they didn't come for a few years after that. So the police reported to the castle authorities, so it was more centralised than, say, the localised police forces in the UK. But a lot of things were happening that influenced, legislation across, Great Britain and Ireland. So, for example, the Clerkenwell disaster, that was the Fenians over in Clerkenwell, and they tried to blow the hole in the prison. I think it was 1882. But the Explosive Substances Act that came thereafter to deal with the Fenians was 1883, and that was specifically motivated to try and get the curb of Fenianism down. But we still use the Explosive Substances Act today. It's still on our statute books. Okay, so there's a lot of sort of cross-pollination.
But this Fenian moment seems to be a real moment in British and Irish policing history. The Dynamite Campaign, as they call it.
The Dynamite Campaign.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Clan of Gael, and you have that huge diaspora in the UK, and you have to think of as well, like even in the War of Independence now, when, Collins got an attack on the docks in Liverpool. So the Irish community, for nationalism in England, it has always traditionally been very strong. And it was a great connectivity. And even as late as the 1940s, I mean, Clan of Gael in America and the S-Plan, I mean, the IRA raised money to bomb British cities through American contacts. So we only talked about it last week. I think it was the Fenian invasion of Canada. So there was a lot happening in the British Empire. The Catalpa escape, I think down in Tasmania. So Ireland was a central focus for radicals.
I was reading about the Fenians in America. They had what they called, it was a dynamite training school in Brooklyn.
Oh, lovely.
But they never called it anything as cruel as a dynamite training school. They called it the Centre for Scientific Warfare.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, or as the press called them, Jeremiah O'Dynamite Rossa, sending young Irish Americans across to London. They look like American tourists, like Yankee tourists. They're sitting in the viewing gallery at the House of Commons, and they're leaving explosive material behind them. It was a very real threat. And I suppose for police in Britain and Ireland, the feeling was that the very dangerous radicals weren't on that side of the Atlantic at all, I suppose. It was
Yeah.
global issue.
And they even got into the DMP headquarters in Dublin Castle on Christmas Day. I think it was 1890, where that poor inspector was having his morning constitution, and the bomb went off, and he was in the loo. You know, that's beside City Hall, where they blew the whole place up. So yeah,
Wow.
they were successful. Plus, you had the whole thing with Parnell. You know, and they were able to sort of tread the radicalism into moderate politics, and they were
Yeah.
able to strike a harder bargain with the more, you know, I suppose, middle of the ground
So before
Irish
we go
Nationalist Party.
really into that G division, I think G division, when we get into it, it kind of sounds like an episode of Peaky Blinders. It's extraordinary. The violence on the streets around the Fenians and later Republicans and the G division. Most policing, you know, we're talking about a city that was divided into divisions A, B, C, D, E, and F, each under the
Mhm.
charge of a superintendent. F sounds like the easiest beat, looking at where they
Yeah,
covered.
yeah.
If you have to be a policeman in Dublin anywhere, be a policeman in Dalkey.
Dalkey, yeah.
But in terms of like what was day-to-day policing like in A, B, C,
Yeah,
D, E,
so
and F?
A was Kevin Street, Chancery Lane, Kilmainham, and I think it had a place on what we call Houston, what they called Kingsbridge. So that was called the college. No, it was the Castle Division, because they were dealing with Dublin Castle. Nowadays, the B deals with Dublin Castle, but they were dealing with Dublin Castle. The B was the College Division, so, and they all had to be 6 foot, right? All those DMP guys had to be 6 foot. The C was the Rotundo, because of course that was such an elegant building. Moss's building up there in the Rotunda, and I think the D was the Barrack Division, right?
Okay.
And the E, I don't think it had a name, but I mean that had stations out in Booterstown and Donnybrook, and it was all very convivial. The F again, Davy Nelligan said about the F that they used to, you know, they discipline guys and send them out to Dalkey, and he went out on an inquiry when he was in the DMP and thought it was the nicest place on God's earth. So what are you doing? Like,
Still
you're
is.
putting all your troublemakers out here. This place is wonderful. An interesting story is until very recently, and I'm talking about maybe the 1980s and early 1990s, all of the sort of journalist crowd and the novelists who lived out in Dalkey would go into Dalkey Garda Station for Christmas morning. Maeve Binchy used to bring in little buns. She'd go in. Bob Fisk used to come up. He didn't bring buns, but he brought a bottle of Sidona, and the lads would have Sidona all day. And that's how Dalkey was, you know.
It's a podcast, so no one will see that wink.
I know.
But for listeners at
Okay.
home, there was a wink. But I mean, the perception of this force, you touched on one of the views of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, that they're very tall. Did it have to be tall?
No,
The six-
5'9" was the DMP, right? So I'm 5'9"
But
and
people weren't
5'8".
as tall as they are today.
No, but you had to be 5'9" to get in. But if you were to serve in the B, in the college division, you had to be 6 foot. The RIC, you had to be 5'8". But
Right.
if your daddy was in the RIC, you only had to be 5'7". So there was this sort of, you know, the lads in the DMP, but oh, look at those, you know, these shrimps, you know, these fellas. So that's how there used to be that bit of rivalry between the two organisations as well.
And I
you know.
remember reading about this character, Tiny, who was particularly tall. The policeman could pick up nicknames, and that's still true
Yeah,
in
but
more recent times.
there's a few guys, like you were talking about the nicknames for police. That's really interesting, because the police will have nicknames for their colleagues.
Yeah.
And the people who deal with the police will have nicknames for the police. And I always say to my people, you know, they're going to get to know you before you know them.
100%.
So like we had one guy in Store Street, Morris Wolf, and he was 6'10". And Morris Wolf was a personality. But Morris got a sponsorship from Raleigh. So they made him an exercise bike. So he's going around the city on his bike, you know. 184B, Zosimus sang about 184B. You know, I think Zosimus...
For anyone who doesn't know, Zosimus was a
blind
street poet.
balladeer, and he was from the Liberties. And of course, if he got his teeth into you, he'd ridicule you. But anyway, 184B, he wrote a song about him, and he used to sing him about it, because 184B, whoever he was, I still haven't been able to identify him. He was a bit zealous in his duties, you know. But look, you move later on and you think of Barton. Like Barton had 2 police medals, right? So he was one of the guys in 1913 who was literally arresting rings around him. I mean, he probably had maybe 60, 70 prisoners. He goes on later, he gets a job in G Squad, he gets promoted to detective sergeant. He's very successful. You know, Collins eventually got him, you know, because he was too good at his job. Collins went and he got him, you know. But that's the type of thing. But look I mean, even in my own career, contemporary, my own memories that not for the podcast, but I mean, there are plenty of guys
with
that
characters.
would be well known around town.
One DMP man who became a larger than life character was Sheehan, a relation of John Sheehan
John
from the
Sheehan,
Dubliners.
yeah.
Famously caught a escaped bull on Grafton Street. It was an amazing story.
Yeah.
But met a kind of tragic end. We were talking about Constable Sheehan because he was a real folk hero in his day.
He was actually stationed in Pearse Street. He spelled his name with an A. I think it was 1905. Dublin we were doing up the sewer network, and I think it was finally finished by the corporation in 1906. So there was a lot of work going on, but workmen got overwhelmed with the methane, and he went down and he rescued him. He rescued some of them. I think one of the workmen died as well. But the only monument to a police officer in Dublin is actually on the end of Hawkins Street in Burke Quay, and that's that lovely ornate marble monument in Irish and English, and that was patronised by the DMP. There is another monument paid for by the DMP subscriptions that people pass every day, and that's the bandstand in St. Stephen's Green.
Yeah,
that is the Jubilee. That was the DMP paid a shilling a week, and they funded that. So if we can get the Garda band to play in it this summer now, I'll let you all know.
Someone told me there's a monument in an underground station in Moscow to a Belfast policeman who sided with Larkin during the big strike in Belfast in 1907, and he refused to send the police against the strikers. So this Belfast policeman has a monument in Moscow. But I love Sheehan's because it's in the Irish language. It's really interesting.
It's phenomenal. It's really good. But you see, you're talking about him and rescuing the community from the escaped bull. But a lot of King's Police medals were awarded for, stopping a runaway horse.
Yeah.
A lot of medals were given out for, investigations into cruelty to animals. Tony Connolly, the RTE guy, his great-grandfather got a medal from the Society for the Preservation of Life from Fire in 1917 when he went into, I think it was Thurles, and he rescued a lady out of a burning house. So, there was a lot of guys, and then of course they got medals for a royal visit and things like that, So there was a lot of ceremony and awards going on, I suppose.
Then came the bad days. I always think about that street rhyme. James Nolan, a trade unionist killed on the streets of Dublin. God bless you, Widow Nolan, your little children tree. The devil take the peelers. The rotten DMP.
Yeah.
When the lockout happens in 1913 and there's literal blood on the streets, the first of 3 bloody Sundays in 20th century Irish history, that's transformative for the DMP, isn't it? And it should be said, the DMP are not the only people throwing batons in 1913.
I would say that the DMP are responsible for the 1916 Rising and therefore the independence we have today. So if you think about what was going on at the time, about half the people in Ireland supported the strikers. About half the people in Ireland didn't support the strikers. So we look through this lens of, what we know is right in our own minds 100 years later. The DMP at the time, there was wet canteens. The RIC were up as well. The RIC, they were over on Princess Street. There's a bit of research done on this. And there was no control. Like if you shout, and I ask any soldier this, once you give the order to fire, you've lost control of what you're doing. Once you give the order to charge, you've lost control of what you're doing. So that's why, I suppose from the 1980s, the public order policing is a lot more restrained. It's a lot more planned and organised. In 1913, those lads had oak batons and they just went for it.
Yeah.
And if you think about the wages were less than an artisan, and the intimidation, like those kids from policemen were going into schools, and the strikers' kids and everything else, and that intimidation. Like Alfie Byrne had a pub in Talbot Street, and the 1913 letters book for the DMP is full of complaints from Alfie Byrne about, newsboys coming in and breaking his windows and intimidating the staff. And if you went into work, it wasn't just policemen being intimidated, it was everybody. Anybody who was going into work who could have striked, who didn't strike, they were subject to that intimidation. So you can feel the division in the community. It's palpable almost,
But historians aren't the only people who record and document history. Photographers can shape our memory of an event as well.
Of course.
And there is that amazing image. I think it's taken from the windows of maybe Cleary's apartment shop, and it shows the baton charge happening on the street below. And it's an amazing image.
Yeah.
But it's worth saying, when we're looking at that moment and people scattering in all directions and bodies on the streets, the RIC are there. I mean, Dublin is a very policed city during the lockout, but the DMP and the folk memory of 1913 are the ones, I suppose, who are at war with Larkin.
Hugely, and that comes from Larkin.
Yeah.
Whereas if you think about where the DMP were living at the time, they're all living in the area. So it's interesting looking at the old diaries, because you find that there's a DMP dwelling in Mullingar House. Beside the Mullingar House in Chapel, is it, in Mullingar Terrace? There's another one at Castleknock. There are more houses around Heytesbury Street. And, the DMP have a great register. It's called the St. Mark's, I think it's the Clothing Society for Children. And they patronise this, and they give like a few quid a week or a few pence a week at the time, and they try and clothe poor kids in the area. And all their addresses are all very local. Whereas if you think of it nowadays, guys are coming up from Carlow to work in Pier Street, or they're coming in from Mullingar to work in the Bridewell. So the DMP families were much more embedded in Dublin than Guards are today.
1913 touches on a good question about policing in general. That's actually kind of contemporary political question as well. A policing question. Is it better when police live in the community they're policing or not? Because in 1913, that was part of the problem, wasn't it? That people were caught up in a row with their neighbours.
But that's the thing. But you see, like the windows were going in and the kids were being intimidated. And that's what was happening to the DMP lads as well. And as I say, the other workers, the barmen and, the tram drivers and the artisans. So, yeah.
There were other people to be arrested around that time. The little rhyme was, Mary had a little bag and in it was a hammer. Mary was a suffragette. For votes, she used to clamour. She broke a pane of glass one day. Like any naughty boy, a constable he came along, and now she's in Mountjoy. So you had suffragettes breaking windows. You had all kinds of political
really great stories.
agitation.
Yeah, my niece has just been doing her thesis on the suffragettes, and it's about the arrests, and a lot of it is malicious damage or obstruction. And a lot of the major suffragettes from the UK came over. And I mean, for example, the Royal Irish Academy had a bust of John Redmond, and one of the ladies went in and painted it. But I won't tell you the confusion it caused for the poor researcher, because the poor researcher thought it was a boat, and the first inquiry went down to Dublin Port to Large Eye to see if he could find it, but it wasn't. It was in the Royal Irish Academy. So it's very interesting what was going on, and it wasn't just windows, it was people being sort of assaulted. And
I was reading about Hanny Sheehy Skeffington, who was out breaking windows, and the policeman who arrived to arrest her didn't realise she was left-handed. So he grabbed her right arm and she was able to break a few more windows in the process.
Yeah.
But in England, you had suffragettes, for example, burning post boxes full of mail, breaking windows on Oxford Street.
I think Asquith got a hammer or a hatchet thrown at him.
Yes, on the O'Connell Bridge, which is amazing. And it thankfully didn't hit him. I think it grazed Redmond. But I suppose the DMP went from being, in the days of someone like Sheehan, day-to-day policing, chasing bulls down Grafton Street, to being entangled with Larkinites and suffragettes and everything else. That puts pressure on policemen on an individual basis, I suppose.
I don't.
Their own allegiances.
Yeah, but it doesn't come true in the diaries. It doesn't come true in the complaints into the Commissioner's office. Yeah. It doesn't come true in the disciplinary files. I can tell you the disciplinary files are all about finding Constable Donald Fallon in Yates's bar in North Dale Street when he should have been on the GPO.
Okay,
that's where so I haven't been able to find that groundswell of discontent, And the thing is as well, during the War of Independence, you have to remember, Collins had the DMP turned inside out.
Yeah. But before we get to the War of Independence, the Easter Rising, I love reading the accounts of Ned Broy, DMP. He goes down to O'Connell Street, he looks at, or Sackville Street, and he looks at what's happening, and he describes barefoot young urchins riding bicycles stolen from the shops, women from the slums wearing fur coats, members of the underworld carrying umbrellas. I love that the first thing you would loot is an umbrella.
Yeah.
But 1916 seems to have been a turning point in a big way. First of all, the looters are a real phenomenon in policing history, in that they arrest more women than men after the Rising. Must be the only time in history that more women than men are dragged before the courts in Dublin. Yeah,
I don't know about that, but I suppose like people do crazy things when law and order breaks down. I mean, decent, ordinary, law-abiding people can go a bit nuts. And, a gramophone going down Henry Street to go into a tenement dwelling when there's no records, that's just part of it.
The DMP took a piano out of a tenement block.
Yeah, they weren't the only people to take pianos out of tenements. But, the pawn system was up and running as well.
Yeah.
And bartering. And you can swap and you can trade. And, a lot of stuff went missing, But yeah, you're right about the clothing. I mean, like Arnott's, God loved them. They didn't have a stitch left.
The man who witnessed the looting and wrote about it so beautifully was Ned Broy. Everything is about to change in the DMP with the Irish Revolution. And it's extraordinary, really, isn't it, how the G Division, the Republican movement, really focus on getting into the intelligence division of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Yeah. And it becomes a kind of, we might say, a double agent in the Irish Revolution.
Just the precursor to that, the Irish government weren't the first ones to talk about change. So the report on the amalgamation of the DMP and the RIC was done in 1912. It was a British parliamentary committee. So it was being mooted. Remember, the Home Rule Bill was coming in, and there was talk in police stations around the country, not just in Dublin, that there will be new masters. So that's the first thing. But we go on to say with the revolution, and that kicks in, there's a lot of sympathetic police officers in the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Some are, should I say, ideologically in support. Some know that they better keep their mouth shut. Like Nelligan did great interviews, and he knew that one of his inspectors was onto him. He said he dared open his mouth. And if you're working with a guy like that, and you're afraid to come into work, so that's what was going on. And guys were sent messages and sent warnings, and of course, Collins was quite ruthless about dealing with informants. And he wasn't the only commander. I mean, he had all of his major commanders, not just in Dublin, but around the country. They had no time for informants.
What happens to a number of members of the G Division, it's worth going through it very briefly. You have the Dog Smith, what a name to be known by, the Dog Smith, gunned down on the streets.
Yeah, that's Paddy Smith.
Collins and his hit squad were more than willing to strike these people. In one case, literally outside of a police station. It must have been a very tense time.
They got Barton around on Townsend Street outside the police station. Smith was going down. He tried to make it back into his house there up at, I think, the Prison Officers Club there in Drumcondra. So the guys who were effective, they sent a message to them, But, I mean, if you think about Collins's crew, not only were they trying to get the intelligence themselves, they were doing the surveillance themselves. They were planning the jobs themselves. They were carrying them out themselves. Yeah, so there was an awful lot of work, and there wasn't that sort of sanitized corridor that you would have with intelligence agencies today, where one crew do the surveillance, the other crew, do the intervention, another crew does the search, another crew does the interview. Like, it was hard work, and that's why Collins was paying these guys full time to do it.
But it's quite amazing that the people who are shooting police detectives on the streets were very young people.
Yeah,
Vinnie Byrne and Charlie Dalton, and these were 17, 18-year-old already blooded hitmen.
But who was setting the policemen up? You have to ask that question. Like, the DMP colleagues were setting them up. Like, you have a guy called Danny Mannix over in, I think he's Donnybrook or Irishtown, 89 Echo. Nobody knows about him.
Yeah.
And he meets Collins the night before Bloody Sunday, and he gives him a few targets.
Wow.
And you have Davy Nelligan meeting him in the Gaiety, and he's pointing out, you two of your targets are over there in a box there with women. And, in Michael Collins, you see this great thing about, I think it's Redmond was the assistant commissioner, and he's in his flat in Leeson Street, and Rosie, the cleaner, comes in and she takes out a basket and she puts all these names and addresses of the G-men and the spies together. And it wasn't that. It was DMP men and Irish-leaning soldiers working at night during the curfew, stopping guys who were coming and going at night. They were out, have you got a pass? Where are you going? And getting that English accent and saying, okay, he's up in H Street. And they'd say, right, come on, I'll walk you home because it's a bit dangerous during the curfew. And in case you're not recognised, I do it. And they were going back to Crow Street to the intelligence office, or maybe they were going back to their handlers, and they were saying, listen, Donald Fallon, he's up there on number 6 Hbury Street. This is the second night I've been out there. I'm not happy with him. And then they put surveillance on Donald and they see what happens. And then they're able to identify him. So it's a lot of graft. It's a lot of hard work. And the guys put their neck out for the revolution,
If we're looking at the way that's depicted on the big screen, Neil Jordan's, Michael Collins, if people want to forgive Julia Roberts for that Irish accent, that's entirely up to them. But on the whole, it's a good film. It stood the test of time. One thing about it that I think is unforgivable is the way it depicts Stephen Ray's character.
Yeah.
Roy,
Well,
as
they
being
didn't hang him.
killed in the
Yeah.
heat of the moment. But actually, he lived on to become a policeman.
He became the Garda commissioner, so we know they didn't hang him.
Yeah.
He was detective sergeant in Brunswick Street, which is now Pearse Street. And if you're at that particular junction where the Viking Stein is, that's the only city junction where 6 roads meet in Dublin. On the first floor, that was Ned Bry's office, and it's the one with the curvature window. And Mick Collins used to come in and out of the Townsend Street door.
Yeah.
And Bry would bring him in and he'd spend the evening up there. But interestingly, the key for that door was found, and it was still the same key that Collins, because the locks weren't changed. Yeah, so there's an awful lot of history, and of course McGrath was shot during the rising up on the second floor as well.
So if we move into this post-revolutionary moment, I always think it's such an anticlimactic moment, isn't it? I mean, you fight, as I said yesterday in another panel, you fight a revolution on a big slogan, like "Up the Republic," but then the state that's born out of it, I suppose, has to get on with the day-to-day business of doing things like policing. Before the Gardaí are born, there's the Civic Guard. Presumably, was there an exodus of some policemen when the flag changed and the post boxes were painted green? Did some policemen say, "I'm out of here"?
So the Government of Ireland Act, right, the 1920 Act, that already was a fait accompli. That gave,
that's a good point. People kind of knew
this was on the cards,
Yeah.
right? So there was a bit of a contract for the police. So the RIC guys got 12 years. So if you were 6 months in the RIC at the end of the revolution, you got a pension of 12 years. If you were 6 months at the end of the DMP before the revolution, under British rule, you got a pension of 6 years. Okay, so the British knew, you have to remember as well, the British stopped the DMP from searching the boats coming in and the docks during the War of Independence because they didn't trust the DMP. So they were sort of giving them a kickback at the end of it. The older guys in the DMP, there is a bit of banter that's going around in a few letters saying that, in August of 1922, for example, when the buttons changed, because you remember the whole thing about the buttons with the crown on it, and the uniform stayed the same, but the buttons changed and it became the harp. Because the older lads used to tell the younger lads, listen, this state's going to fail, you're going to be working for buttons. That was the thing they used to talk about in the canteens. But no, I think the issue with the DMP is it went down to 600 and they were completely at their wits' end. They didn't have the personnel to do anything. Remember, they had 4 policewomen. It was the first organisation to have policewomen. They had 4 full-time paid policewomen in the organisation as well. But nobody knew who was in charge. And this is something that I think as historians we have to try and grapple with, because you have the Republican police. Okay, so Michael Staines is looking at them. Then he's setting up the Civic Guard, right? So he's down in Newbridge trying
Go back
to
to this point, the Republican police.
Yeah.
During the revolution, there's Republican courts.
Hugely problematic.
If you're going to take on the largest empire in the world, one way you do it is you encourage a campaign of
non-cooperation,
civil disobedience.
Yeah.
That involves not recognising the police, not recognising the courts. Now the revolution has passed. You have to put the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah,
that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to wind up a revolution, isn't it?
Yes, and you can't look at policing is about people. It's about a 360. You can't look at a police service on its own. Police cannot survive on their own. They have to have the community. They have to have the other institutions of state. So that's what I'm saying. Like, nobody knew who's in charge. You have the Republican police going down into DMP stations with a prisoner. Say, mind him. Who was he? Oh, he's one of the Redicans. Grant. His brother's up in St. Pat's, by the way, but just mind him. Like, what's he arrested for? None of your business. And then Oriel House, which was basically, the provisional government's unit to do their dirty work, they're on the go. So are they in charge? Right? So, Oriel House will come in with a prisoner and they'll come in with a political prisoner. And the Four Courts is occupied. And I actually didn't realise how problematic that occupation was until I got this huge diary from the Crown family that had survived. And it covers the Civil War in the southeast inner city or the southwest inner city. And these guys are coming out of the Four Courts. They're going over, they're doing robberies in Guinnesses. They're robbing Win Stanleys in Back Lane, the bootmakers. They're holding up people on the street. They're taking their cigarettes, they're taking their cash, and they're going right back into the Four Courts. They're going out and they're meeting their pals in the Free State Army for coffee.
They never take the Four Courts to be attacked.
They never shut down. The Free State doesn't shut down the Four Courts because Collins thinks, I'm going to negotiate. These are my lads. I'm going to get them out.
And Sean McBride is in there. Tells a great story years later that every day Sean McBride and Ernie O'Malley would leave the Four Courts, they go to Bewley's,
Yeah.
have breakfast,
Yeah.
and then go back and occupy the forecourts again. So it's like it's an abnormal society.
But it was bizarre.
Yeah.
But what was happening was even civic guards at the time, because remember, only 155 RIC men went into the civic guard. Right? A lot of people would think, who are unfamiliar with Irish history, they say, well, they just changed uniforms from bottle green to blue. They didn't. They disbanded the RIC, and the 155 guys who came into the civic guard were Mick Collins guys. Like Jerry Maher down in Naas became a chief superintendent. He was a sergeant in the RIC. He used to get the ciphers and he'd give them to Mick Collins. Bernard O'Connor down in Kerry, he was the same. He used to let the Kerry Brigade know exactly what was going on. So Collins had his men around the place.
Yeah.
So that was the difficulty. Who was in charge? And then you'd got civic guards who were ex-IRA men. They still had their service weapons from the War of Independence, and they're going up threatening people. They're going up threatening DMP men, saying, get lost. He says, only there's people around here, I'd do you. This is a fella in Weaver's Park. Christmas Day 1922, a DMP man is on the beat and he gets shot by Free State troops. So it's crazy. And the DMP are calling the Free State troops IRA in uniform. It's chaos. I wish somebody with some time would go and take this book and do some doctoral research on it, because it's a phenomenal source of information.
But when the new state is thinking we need a national police force to plaster over the cracks of this post-revolutionary society and try and move on with things, why are the DMP not from the very beginning considered a part of that project? Like, is it a cultural thing, or why is the DMP essentially not subsumed into Garda Síochána until 1925?
Because I think we don't give each other enough credit. If you think of what's happening in 1922, 23, 24, there's a new army, there's new court systems, there's new civil service. The Department of Education is changing. Ardna Crush is getting up and running. Think about everything that the Free State government were trying to achieve. And they wanted our society to return to normal. They wanted us to forgive each other in terms of what was going on. You think of the Lamass family, for example. In 1915, Sean Lamass and Nafina Aaron accidentally shoots his 2-year-old brother in the house in Capel Street. Later on in 1923, his older brother, who was back from England, wanted to get his job back in Dublin Corporation. A couple of anti-treaty guys want to settle a few scores. A couple of Free State guys want to settle a few scores. They abduct him and they murder him. There's an awful lot of what's going on around the country. The land grab is going on. The Special Infantry Corps is going on down in Wexford, where Mick Collins had actually said, if anybody is involved in agrarian unrest, just shoot them. That was the order. So we had a lot to do, and we had a lot to forgive one another about as well. And policing was on the back burner as long as when the armed crime was grappled with. Until 1925, rural Ireland was crazy. It was chaotic. It was as bad as the Southwest Inner City during the Civil War, if not worse, because you had gangs of criminals basically hiding out, intimidating people, coming into the houses, taking over the house.
Guns everywhere. No fear of death.
No, because the Civic Guard were only getting up and running, and they were unarmed. Yeah. So we've interviews with guys conducted in the 1970s by Greg Allen, and he's saying, well, what was it like when you started off? And I said, well, we just went out and we told the lads there in their new uniforms, go out and walk up and down the street and let everybody see you and walk back. So he's down in a town in Tipperary, and everybody came out from their houses to look at the guards. These two fellas walking up and down the street. And when he was briefing
the only unarmed men on the street.
Absolutely. And when he was briefing, this guy was an ex-RIC guy, and he left the RIC, he joined the revolution, he fought in the IRA, and then Collins asked him to come back in. And he was the expert. And he said that when he was in the station, they were around him. They were like children looking up at him. How do I police? What do I do? And he said he went back a few weeks later and he said, they were grand. They were flying it. But the issue in terms of the amalgamation was the Civic Guard lacked professionalism. They lacked the ability to investigate. They didn't really know what they were doing, because like 96% of the Civic Guard were ex-IRA men, and they would have been quite active. Some of them were officers, and they would actually simply lead their battalion from Clare or from Laois or whatever, and they would get off the train at Kingsbridge, as they said, and they would march down to Donnybrook, and they would sign the whole squad up as Civic Guards. And that's how it was done. Actually, some counties were better at it than others, to an extent that Kevin O'Higgins had to put put a stop on the lads coming from Clare and Kerry who were trying to take over the guards, because they just seemed to have all their lads going up to join the Civic Guard.
Well, yeah, they've gone from a flying column, unpaid volunteer,
Very
fighting in the
difficult.
mountainside,
And
to a pensionable job like that.
yeah, but the dynamic, if you think about it, you could have been my CO when we were in the flying column. We end up working in the same station. I'm now an inspector and you're a guard.
Yeah, the hierarchies were
Are you
transformed.
going to do what I ask you? Because you're going to remind me of all the times you saved me life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
on the side of a mountain in Tipperary or whatever
exactly.
it was. Yeah,
you know, so and I think that culture in Ireland about getting things done, you know, oh, you have to fill out this form, you have to do that. No, oh yeah, done. Can you get that done? Yeah. I mean, a lot of that stems from, you know, in my world anyway. I think a lot of that stems from how we did business many years ago. You know.
Coming to the very last days of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, it's a really high drama end to their story.
Yeah.
The commissioner is a guy Murphy. He's a World War I veteran. He's the first Irish-born commissioner of the DMP.
Yeah, and Catholic.
And the last one, a Catholic.
Yeah.
He leads what is one of the big moments of the DMP's story, which is the raids into Monto. Which always called it Night Town.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think the Legion of Mary shut down Monto. I don't think it was. I don't think it was the police at all.
See, the Legion of Mary couldn't arrest anyone; they could just shame them.
Yeah, but you see, the DMP went from. You have to get your letters right here. The WEJ, the Wedge, Walter Edgeworth Johnson, who was a character in himself, and his family are actually still knocking around, and to WRA. So William, his daughter only died 2 years ago. She was 103, I think. Yeah. He was the last commissioner of the DMP, but he knew that this amalgamation was coming. And of course, a lot of guys were quite chauvinists and sort of, you know, they wanted the DMP to last. They saw the DMP as, you know, a highly commendable force and they were very invested in it. And of course, it had its own traditions. But yeah, he fought for them to keep it. But, you know, O'Higgins knew, he said, he just didn't have the expertise in the rest of the country. He didn't have the guys trained with firearms in the rest of the country. He was trying to put down what was going on in places like Leitrim, for example, and West Clare, who's entirely lawless. And if you think about it, the courts were only being bedded in as well. So a lot of what we had with those Sinn Féin courts you're talking about, they were coming into the Courts Act of 1924. So there was a good blend of interests from around the country. So it was quite democratic in how those decisions were taken. But yeah, the big raid you're talking about is March 1925. And it is Frank Duff of the Legion of Mary. And Frank Duff was Mick Collins' personal secretary. So he still carried a lot of informal authority, and he got things going. And there was a huge organised criminal network in that area, and it's been said to me with confidence that the girls of the Monto did more damage to the British than the IRA could ever do, because if you look at the medical records going back to the 1860s, about 70 or 80% of the British soldiers stationed in Dublin have venereal disease. So there's a lot going on, but basically the dynamic is people were so invested in it, they owned property, they were well established.
By the way, often women. I mean,
yes,
the
very much
madames who ran Monto, and ran it ruthlessly, and were willing to toss women into the street, for disobeying them. It was people like May Oblong. It was
Becky Cooper, Mary Mack.
It's something that shouldn't be romanticised. Monto.
Mary Mack was arrested in 1916 looting. As proof were needed that, you know, criminals will just do anything to turn a bob. But there's a good story that sort of survived in the DMP, and it's a bit of folklore, and it's about Walter Edgeworth Johnson when he was saying goodbye after independence, you know. And he went down and he was doing a bit of a roadshow, and he was going to all the stations, and he was meeting the superintendents and the constables, and he was having a drink with them, shaking hands. And he went down to Store Street, and he met the superintendent there, and he said goodbye and thank you very much. You're a gentleman, it's lovely. And he says, I'm going to go up now to the parochial house in Sean McDermott Street, and I'm going to say goodbye to Father Diffley, we call him, you know, Strumpet City sort of stuff. And the super, being, you know, still very operationally inclined, said I'll tell you what, Commissioner, I'll send two of the lads with you. So Walter Edgeworth Johnson, this fine British Army veteran, joined of a man, the guy who actually brought Davy Nelligan back in to do all the damage. He's been escorted up Railway Street with two constables. And he goes up to one of the DOS houses, and one of the ladies is at the door, Becky Cooper, and she says to him, Mr. Commissioner, if you're looking for Janine, she's working down in number 7. I don't know how true that is.
Just a final question for you, Paul. It strikes me we still have the Dublin Metropolitan Division.
Nope.
It's
Dublin Metropolitan Region now.
Dublin Metropolitan Region.
Yeah.
I think about the carved heads there. Next time you're in the capital, you'll see them on Pierce Street. There's still a handful of those police lamps on stations. There's little remnants of the DMP still around us today.
An interesting vignette for the cornice work on Pierce Street Garda Station is one of the masons who carved those faces. His great grandson is a detective in Pierce Street.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, yeah, you've got those bits, and then you've got the red lamp at Kevin Street. But Kevin Street is going to be the Armed Support Unit in Kevin Street, the old depot at the time, because, nowadays we call the depot the Garda depot in the Phoenix Park, but Dubliners would have referred to the depot as Kevin Street. So that's there, but there's, we still have the offices, say, in Dublin Castle, the Chief Commissioner's house. There's another interesting story about that, where the German spy committed suicide. And like Clontarf, for example, Mountjoy, Pierce Street, the Bridewell, they were built specifically, Fitzgibbon Street specifically, as DMP stations. There was a DMP station in Manor Street, number 40. There was a DMP station in Booterstown. There was a DMP station in Parkgate Street. There was a DMP station in Chapel Izzard, which is now the Lions Club. So yeah, a lot of them are still there. We're still using their.
So the DMP is a lingering ghost, you might say, over in Garda Síochána.
It's been expressed as we are the linear descendants of the DMP, but it is. Look, I mean, we try to promote that type of Dublinese within the Garda Historical Society, because so many of the guards working there are from Garda families, and those parents and grandparents, their parents and grandparents might have been in the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Yeah. So we try and capture that,
So I just want to thank Paul for his brilliant contribution to this festival. This is the first year of the Kilkenny Law Festival. It's a brave, bold and new idea from Laoise and his team, and hopefully in the years to come it will be a fixture of the calendar in this city that has so many wonderful festivals. Why not one more? And just this week we were all reminded of the dangers on Garda Síochána face and the bravery that they apply into their day-to-day job. So it was wonderful to have on Garda Síochána involved in the festival in its inaugural year. And thank you all very much.
Thanks for that. Thanks,